So good morning here in Davos. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And we're here this morning to talk about leadership and empathy. And that's after the COVID-19 crisis has really focused us on some of those issues. I think if COVID had two big effects on organizations, the first was to require everyone in organizations to suddenly focus, if they hadn't before, to focus more on their colleagues, their employees, and to think about how to get through together. So it had an amplification of empathy, even in some surprising places. But I think as the crisis has gone on, and now people are grappling with how to get people back to work, there's a different set of challenges that are facing organizations. We've learned that there are some things that you can't do when everyone's working from home, and that sometimes make empathy difficult. That we find it difficult to be creative and innovative when we're each in our own bubble at home. That the initial thing of dialing everybody in and the organizations being inclusive quite quickly became silos that we now have to bust by bringing people back into work. And that onboarding new people, the apprenticeship function, training people, is really difficult if everybody's working from home. So what I'd like to do this morning with these three fantastic panelists is dive in and think about what we've learned about empathy during the last 2 years of crisis, but also what we've learned about the limits and challenges of empathetic leadership. And I couldn't ask for better panelists. And so starting on my left, we have Kashaya Farmanbar, Minister for Energy and Digitization in the government of Sweden. A little fact you won't know about Kash is that he loves to make music. And one of the bonuses of COVID was that he got to make more music during COVID, which sounded great. To his left, we have Lieve Mostry, based in Brussels, the CEO of Euroclear. What you won't find out about Lieve is she became a grandmother twice during COVID. So lovely to have you with us, Lieve. And then we have Marjorie Krause, the extraordinary founder and CEO of APCO. And Marjorie has written Roots and Wings during the crisis. The things that we must give to our kids, their rootedness, and then the wings to fly, which in her book, she argues, gives us a guide for how we should run our company and interact with our employees. But let's jump right in with this wonderful crew. And let me start, Kash, with you. So what did you learn about empathy during the crisis? And what's your sense of its limits? Where do we find that we've actually got to set it aside?
I think one of the realizations was that when we meet with each other at the coffee machine at the office, there's a lot of empathy going on there that you don't actually categorize as empathy. You talk to each other, how's the kids, how's the family, do you like the weather, and these small talks. And normally it's kind of small talks that delay the start of the meeting. But when you get to the COVID situation, when you just jump into Zoom or Teams meeting and you're running that meeting and then it stops and then you go to the next meeting back to back normally, then after a while you realize, so where is the people inside this? I think you mentioned silent, Irene, and that's a great description of it, because one of the things that kind of disappeared is, at the start was the creativity of creating new initiatives. But the digital work worked really well for delivering on already taken initiatives. So we were kind of living on old creativity. And I think empathy and creativity goes really hand to hand. So that was one of the things I realized.
And you know, as you tried to be more empathetic to all those working with you, were there any points of tension in that? You know, where you're the minister with a very important portfolio. There's a lot of work to get done, but people in their private lives, you know, having many more difficulties that suddenly you had to be more aware of. How did you balance that?
I mean, that's one of the things that you also realize, because just in Sweden we didn't have the lockdown as many other countries have, and you're able to say that I want you at the office. But then you're realizing that the people you're working with maybe are actually afraid to taking the boss to the office because they have a close family member who's got COVID, and they're really worried. So that drives a next level of empathy handling that you need to be able to do, that Zoom or Teams isn't really built for, and being able to book time to talk about these human things with your colleagues is one of the ways, and also one of the lessons to take from this. Don't take the human aspect too lightly. It's really important factor for the work to flow well as well.
Thank you, Kashaya. Liva, what about in your organization?
Thank you, Nairi. When our organization of 4,000 people worldwide really overnight had to go working from home because of the COVID crisis, it kind of posed a double challenge. You have on the one hand the logistics challenge to have everything running smoothly and your continuity of business, but there is also a huge emotional side to it. And I think for us as leaders, it is really important to balance both elements in there. You cannot just look at the logistics alone. The emotional side is very important. Euroclear, very unfortunately, lost a colleague that was well known in the organization very, very early in the crisis. So that added to the need for empathy, and that added to the level of uncertainty that all staff members had about their health, about their job, about their family members. And I think it is very important as a leader to demonstrate that you can relate to these uncertainties, that you even share them yourself. And so what we did very rapidly, we said there are basically two simple goals for the organization in this crisis. First of all, it's all about the well-being of our staff, that we learned the very hard way by losing this colleague, how important this was. And on the other hand, business continuity for our clients. And the good news is that we were able to continuously say, and those two objectives go really hand in hand, because without the well-being of our staff, we would not have the continuity of business for our clients. So that was very good. I believe also that next to these simple goals, it is important that all leaders across the organization show themselves from the most honest, authentic, and even vulnerable side. Yes, there were things that we were not knowing either. And then it makes no sense to try to fool your colleagues. They know it just as much as you do. So these simple messages, this authenticity, I believe this was really key in order to manage with the whole of the organization through the crisis.
And now that you're coming out of the crisis, in fact, most organizations are facing a new and different crisis with Russia. How does that translate across?
Well, I think it is interesting to see, unfortunately, that we come from one crisis to the other, and the Russian crisis affects our business quite substantially and in a very unpredictable way. And so I think this requires a bit of a different leadership, because here we are in a situation where we sometimes have to make fast decisions, quick analysis, strong alignment across everybody. And so this is, very interestingly, an environment that requires a bit more of a decisive mode rather than the listening, empathetic, and prudent emotional mode that we had to be in the COVID crisis. It's for me an interesting observation as well to see this difference in requirements given the different type of crisis.
Mm-hmm. And where does that get tested? Where is it that you've really got to just, is there an example you could give us of where you've really just got to put that empathy that's been finely honed by COVID aside and say, actually, we've got to get on with this job?
Well, I would say, for instance, in the return to office policy, We want to be pretty broad. We want to delegate the rules. We don't want to have a one-size-fits-all. So that I think that is from the more empathetic side, we can have that very much. But when it comes to making decisions on how to financially organize ourselves in the context of the Russian crisis, there is no time to lose. There we really have to be decisive, and we have to go all the way in a very rapid manner. So that is a big difference for us.
Marjorie, does any of that ring true for you? You were leading your organization, huge organization, hit by both COVID and, of course, the George Floyd killing in the United States with its huge reverberations. Do what our fellow panelists say, does that ring true for you?
Most of it is exactly the same. I think we have a common experience if we're running an organization during a crisis like COVID, that you have to learn to listen to your employees and get the sense of the mood of your employees, maybe in ways you never thought of before. And I think reaching out and doing, I was part of a number of CEO groups where we shared information during this time, and it was amazing how similar the feeling was of moving more toward purpose and moving more toward reinforcing those things, those values of your company that bind people together, but to do it in a way that also solicited more feedback from employees. I think the things that were different for us is that we have a very dispersed workforce. We work in 35 countries. It's about 1,000 people. But we were probably the second users of Zoom 3 or 4 years before the crisis. So everybody was had worked remotely, even if they were in their office, because they were working remotely with other offices and other time zones. So our switch and we're a consulting firm, so clients are in the middle. So reinforcing that with people that this is going to be as much business as usual, and we have to remember that empathy goes to our clients as well as each other, because they're suffering through this and they're trying to figure it out, and we need to step up and provide more, more help when we can. I think that was kind of a common rallying call, and people were terrific about doing that. But I think the other thing that happened is that the employees formed support groups for each other. So we had one for young mothers that would, you talked about the isolation of Zoom. We learned about everybody's families. We did calls where there were dogs and cats and babies crawling around, and you learn to be much more personal, and even with the people who were not part of your team but clients, you just learned about everybody's life a lot more. The second thing that happened that I thought was really interesting is that we onboarded a lot of people, and I agree that was the hardest part, is that if you're a strongly culture-driven organization and you're onboarding people and they've never been in one of your offices, or they've never been at the water cooler, or they don't know that much about the other people, you have to be very proactive in finding ways to bring them together. And so that was also a very big challenge to try to do that. And so these other groups started forming.
And Marjorie, just on that,
Yeah.
do you have to now put some of that kind of back in the box, the babies, the dogs? I can think of a very large global company that had a slogan, "Bring your whole self to work," which they quite quickly changed to "Bring your best self to work." And I just wonder, is that part of the transition out of this, kind of all out there?
Yeah, I think we don't know that yet. And I think that was the other thing I was going to say, is that, boy, you really had to be transparent and honest in this, because everybody was in uncertain times. And you couldn't let on that you knew something that you didn't know. And so whenever we would say, okay, here are the rules for the next near normal, the next phase, because we didn't know and we didn't make promises we couldn't keep. So it was like, this will be over, and we're going to keep telling you everything we know when we know it. But so I think for the question you're asking, it's very hard to know what the accepted norm is going to be for these kind of things. because I think we're still not out of the crisis period.
Now, I'm going to come to you guys to get you working in a minute. So you might be wanting to reflect on your question or comment. Just before we do, I would like to just come to Kasia and then back to Lieve. Kasia, in the public sector, you know, the people that work for you are there to serve the public. So what have we learned about how to stay better connected with the public? And how do you in your ministry, how do you ensure that every employee is staying close to the public they're supposed to be serving?
I would say, I mean, although Sweden didn't have the kind of lockdown that like many other countries have, we're still a very large and long country with long distances. So one of the practical successions within the COVID crisis is that the digital area or digital work is here to stay, and that goes between colleagues, but also with the public and others. And I really quite I remember just before the COVID crisis, we had a meeting, and there was one lady. She traveled almost an hour to get to that meeting, and that meeting was like 9 minutes, and then she had to go back. And so I know that I felt so bad afterwards. It was like coming here I should have put in some seminar or something. She was traveling 1 hour to just this 9 minutes meeting. So I think that's like Winston Churchill once said, never waste a good crisis. So is there anything we can take from COVID is that digital is here to stay, and there is a new way to work and to keep connected with the public and with your colleagues. We need to work on the empathy way of it, of course, but I think it's a real opportunity that's really driving the digital transformation that we so need also. So that's one of the things I see. And as a consequence, we are also getting better to have connection with public through digital, even after the pandemic.
Lieve, do you think there's likely to be something missing in a bureaucracy that just uses digital to interact with citizens?
Oh, I would not necessarily judge on that. That is asking a lot. There was another point that I would want to make, however. I think we talk a lot about the end of the COVID crisis, but I think even if health-wise everything is over at this point in time, I think we should not underestimate that in the mental well-being for many of our people, this is not necessarily over yet. And what we do see in our organization is that we have quite a number of people that have gone into burnout. And mostly we see that with people that were alone at home during the lockdowns, which was a very difficult situation, for whom the work environment is an important social element. So that is a dimension. We see a number of people really re-questioning their life, their professional life, how they want to take it, and those people also need support. They need to be feeling that the company can be receptive for that, but also supports them in not taking hasty decisions. So the element of mental well-being is an element in which we have been investing a lot, support coaches for the people, and I think this is something that will be important still for quite a while. I believe we are really not fully out of the crisis, even if pure health-wise COVID doesn't come back. I think we should have that in mind as organizations.
I totally agree with that. I think it's almost like post-traumatic stress. I don't think we will know when it's over. I think our employees are much more affected, and management much more affected by this because it has caused severe stress. For some people, even what you were saying about the transportation, going to work, they may be happy being at work, but if your office is in the middle of New York City or a big city, taking public transport is still very stressful. And I don't think I think as companies have never really coped with mental health issues, but I think they're very pressing. And
Marjorie, how do you balance the needs of your employees and not letting your clients down. Yours is a very client-focused business. So just how do you navigate that?
Well, I think, you know, we try to have balanced teams around the employees, and we also do a lot of, we have a resource management group that tries to, in addition to their direct managers, that tries to assign people according to interest and passions. That doesn't always work out, but we do it as much as we can because it feeds on itself. And I think if people are working with people they enjoy and are accomplishing things for their clients, it's a good feeling, it's a positive feeling. But I think to do that, you have to stay in much closer touch than even we have in the past. And I think we're very committed to doing that, but it's a lot harder than it looks. And you make mistakes as you go, but you have to find that balance, because if you don't give people the reason to come to work, you know, I always think passion is our secret sauce. If they don't find that passion, they're not going to do a good job.
Let me come to the audience for any comments and questions. We have one right here, ready to go. Do we have a microphone? It's just coming. Just because we have an audience, we're live streamed. So.
A question for Mr.
Do introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Manny Axe. I wanted to ask Mr. Farmanbar, you do music, and I suppose you do music with other people. How did that work during the pandemic?
That's actually a really good question, and a really good answer for that too, because a Swedish company doing online-based digital or digital audio workstation called, I'm going to name them, called Soundtrap. And so I started doing, because I was doing some beats and some cool synth-based bass, and then I sent it to one of my friends who do a lot of rock music, and he just texted me back, you need some guitars on that. Then he put it on that, and it sounded great. So I think there are also new opportunities to
a series of things
yeah.
you would add as you go.
Definitely. It was a sequential, but also, I mean, iterative work on doing that. So it was really fun.
It's a great question for all those of us that had to endure colleagues trying to sing Happy Birthday together on a Zoom. Horrible experience. Second question. No, just in front, and then we'll come to... Yep.
Hi, thank you for this really interesting panel.
Do introduce yourself.
I'm Stav. I'm the leader of the Green Party in Israel and former member of parliament. And currently I'm building what we call empathy schools that are based on integrating young people with autism and disabilities inside universities. And as part of that, increasing the empathy levels of the students that are involved in the program from outside of the disability spectrum. And this is actually my question to you. I think our society needs an empathy training, and that it's far more severe than the situation that we just discussed here. And we see it with technology. While technology, we would expect that with our grown exposure to what's going on in the world through technology, we would also have much more care for that as a society. However, I think we see that in most cases, we don't. So empathy needs much more work, and part of that is done through meeting with people who are not the usual people that we meet, so people with disabilities, people who are from a different community. And I'm wondering what kind of work you think could be done in order to increase that in your companies or generally in policy, because that's where we develop these bridges.
So let's break this into, because we've just been talking about empathy as this kind of big squishy thing. Could you give us each one kind of skill that we need to hone in order to improve the kind of empathy that helps us build great organizations?
Well, I would start with listening as a skill that, people say we have two ears, and one mouth. And I guess we learned that during this time. And I think that listening carefully to what employees need and want, or what other people need and want, and not presuming you have the solution, is a very important skill. And one quick story is that you asked about the George Floyd situation and how that affected everything. there was probably no more critical moment in our company for building empathy than to realize that our minority or African American employees especially were greatly affected by what happened, even more than everybody else, and even though everybody was affected. And we found a few brave people willing to tell their life story to the rest of the staff. And I have to say that it totally changed the way people related to each other. So listening and listening to people whose history and stories are different than yours is really important.
Such an important point. The difference between listening and waiting for your turn to speak is enormous. I observed a workshop where Alpha CEOs were asked to spend 3 minutes listening to somebody else without interrupting and without questioning them. And you could see it was physically painful for most people in the room. So I just want to underscore what Marjorie's saying there about listening. What would your one be, Lieve?
Well, listening is very important, and we also have in our own organization, in the context of diversity and inclusion, we have created communities where people find each other, where they can bring their messages that are specific for their communities, be it for disabled people, people of a different ethnicity, LGTB community. So I fully agree with the listening that Marjorie puts up front. I would also add to that authenticity. If you cannot expect that people feel comfortable to come with their own elements, their own identity to the company, if as leaders you are not felt to be authentical and really putting your own identity to the table as well. So I think that is the second one I would add to listening.
And Lieve, can I pick you up on the first one, this kind of solidarity case? A lot of companies are worried about this. They're worried that if they encourage subgroups of employees around identity to form, that it will fragment their organization. Can you reflect on that? For what would you say to a CEO that puts that back to you?
I would say it's always an end story. I don't believe that it is because people feel happy to come together in certain communities to address specific topics that they consider relevant for them in that community, that they position themselves outside the bigger group of the company. I think it's really an end story. And I think that is the way to foster it as well. Going forward. I would not see that as an opposition at all.
And part of what Marjorie was telling us is that those groups help amplify a voice that you wouldn't otherwise hear, so it helps the listening process.
One other thing you can do that we've done, I think, that also makes sure that we don't fragment, is that those groups invite other people to their meetings. And so if you have an LGBTQ group and they invite some people that may be in the parents group or something like that, that it just creates better understanding of the issues faced by people in these various subgroups.
Hashaya, what would you say?
I would agree, of course, with listening and authenticity. And if I would add something to it, it would be curiosity. To actually be curious about the people or the person you have in front of you, whether it's on the screen or physical. To actually want to know what this person is longing for, what this person is actually interested in. And seeing it from a broader perspective, we see that with online platforms, with social media, we have the ability to interact with more people than we would have done otherwise. There is sometimes a problem with algorithms that create these bubbles that either just show us what we want to see in other people or what we really hate to see, because that drives interaction. But handled in the right way, these platforms can also be a good way to actually be actually curious instead of being angry at the person on the other side. And that if we can make that shift through innovation, through regulation, through new technology, you name it, that would be great benefit for humanity.
And again, hugely difficult in in a culture in which people are increasingly, I disagree with you, so I'll cancel you, I'll swipe left and right according to whether I agree with you or not, that instinct to say, this person has a view which feels offensive to me, so let me learn more about why. Let me learn more about what that person is actually trying to say. Very, very difficult in today's climate. I know we're out of time. I'm getting the message from over there. Do we have 3 more seconds?
We have 1 minute.
Okay, a quick flurry.
My name is Jimmy Alkazen. I run a family office out of Geneva, and I want to say something about dogs. My daughter works for WeWorks in Paris, and during the confinement, she got a dog, so she could walk walk the dog because she was allowed to walk the dog. And now she takes the dog to the office.
Fantastic. And here.
My comment.
Take the microphone. Yeah.
We have a dog park at the top of our
Jeremy
building
Garrett
in
Cox
Leland.
from the UK. I run a school and I also mentor individuals and businesses. And one of the things I would say with regard to being empathetic, one, I'm surprised that people don't think that being empathetic is essential to leadership and one needs a crisis to deal with it. I think the businesses that had empathetic leaders did much better in the crisis. I would say be imaginative. How many businesses did I speak to who said, or individuals who said, we couldn't replicate the round the coffee machine or the water fountain chat. How many people actually thought, how could I bring that into my day on an online basis? How many people could leave a meeting at 11:59 in an ordinary world and get to the 12 o'clock meeting? Yeah, and yet people were doing that on Zoom. Why didn't they just imagine they needed to leave their previous meeting 10 minutes earlier? Those sorts of things, to me, I think are essential. You need to, if you were changing your environment and restructuring your company, to deal with that, you would have thought of all of these things in detail. And I don't think people went into the crisis really imagining what they were trying to deal with their workforce.
That's fantastic. So a quick checklist for us. How can we learn this year to listen better, genuinely listen better? How can we learn to help those without a voice come together so that we can amplify that voice? How can we be more authentic and encourage others to be the same? How can we be more curious in the face of people that we might want to otherwise cancel? How can we be more imaginative and get beyond we do it this way because we've always done it that way? Thank you all so much for this conversation about empathy and leadership and sometimes its limits. All the best.